We are going to talk a little bit about community. We have had a chance so far to talk about impact and how we communicate impact. What you heard Asha say, which was incredibly relevant, and what you have also heard Jane and Paige say, is how different communication can be, and how we communicate impact is so important, but how that also changes and how we can create the kind of communication that is going to draw people in and have them understand what it is we are trying to do. So we want to make sure that we are reaching all of those ambassador bases, not just donor bases, but those champions and ambassadors, and our next panel is going to do that. So please help me in welcoming Barbara O'Reilly, who is going to be moderating our panel and is a colleague of mine on the board of the Wise Giving Alliance, I am delighted to say. She is the founder and principal at Windmill Hill Consulting. It is a nonprofit fundraising consulting group, and Barbara will take us through the panel that is joining her. Thank you.
On? No. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just delighted. Asha always leaves very big shoes to fill and to follow, so I'm delighted to be part of this panel this afternoon, and I'm incredibly inspired by the panelists today. As Pratichi mentioned, we're going to be talking about how do we take all of the incredible inspiration and ideas and data that we learned this morning, and how do we then apply it into action, into communicating impact to our donor audiences and our segments? And we've kept the word segment intentionally broad. It could be lots of different. Sometimes it's by giving level, sometimes it's by donor type, by demographics, by roles, as we heard about this morning. So we want to be able to dive into the ways we think about nuancing the messaging and our communication strategy, because we saw that the world is changing. I thought before this morning that it was just a crisis in the US, and I was a little sorry to see that it's a worldwide crisis of declining donors and volunteers. But I'm inspired by the power of this community to be able to turn that around. So how do we know what donor communications and effective donor communications around impact looks like? Joining me this afternoon, Jean Ekias, President and CEO of Creating Healthy Communities, Brady Josephson, Vice President of Marketing and Growth at Charity Water, and Julia Ritz-Toffoli, the Principal Behavioral Designer at Ideas 42. All right, so we will try to leave time at the end for questions as well. Let's just start with the big meta question. We know that the one-size-fits-all communication strategy just is terrible, right? It doesn't work, it's not effective, and as we heard this morning about donors and our volunteers, our champions want that sense of community, that's absolutely the worst way to try to create that sense of community. So when you think about donor communications that are effective around impact, how is your organization's donor engagement strategy shaped? And Jean, let me start with you, because you're taking, creating healthier communities from a workplace giving funded organization, very different mindset, very different sort of funding structure, to one that's an intentionally built culture of philanthropy. And you're putting in all of those building blocks. So walk us through what that looks like for you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I have just celebrated my one-year anniversary as the CEO of the organization. CAC has been around for nearly 65 years, dedicated to addressing the barriers to health at the community level. And as Barbara mentioned, we have historically been an organization that had a workplace giving type of business model, which was pretty much transactional fee-for-service. And over the course of the last 5 years, have really wanted to build upon that by really creating a culture of philanthropy to kind of think about exactly what are the opportunities to create even more impact beyond our workplace giving model, given the rising needs that communities actually face. So part of that strategy has been twofold. One is internally structuring our organization, both in terms of building the culture mindset in terms of exactly what is philanthropy. Can we have consistent definition exactly what do we mean as an organization around philanthropy? And then the second aspect of that too is how do we start to think about the data that we currently have in terms of cultivating, expanding, and then also think about retaining. and ensuring that there's greater data integration. And then finally, and more importantly, is the fact that over the course of the last year, we really spent some time building upon the amazing work that the team has done over the past 65 years, thinking about that sense of why. What is the why? And I think that gets to the points that were made earlier today in terms of exactly if we are going to focus on, and I love the point that was mentioned, I said ban the term donor and use the term owners of our mission. If we're going to expand the number of people who are owners of our mission, why should they care? Why should they even focus on this particular mission? And that took us down a journey as an organization to think about a couple of things. One is, what is the problem that we are uniquely here to solve as an organization? What are the opportunities to think about this through partnerships, broadly defined, both individual, institutional? What are the opportunities to say, what is that call to action? And can we get people to rally around that? So it was goal setting, it was greater clarity within the organization, and then we did some test and learn. What is our case for support? And can we consistently say that across the entire organization? So even on our fee-for-service side, which has been our workplace giving model, they have evolved their thinking in terms of exactly as we do work, particularly with our nonprofit partners, what are the opportunities to bring them along on this journey with us in terms of our new mission as an organization, which is to address health inequities across this country? And how can we help cultivate those relationships from one that's transactional to one that's more transformative, because they are becoming owners of our mission. And we've seen significant improvements in that. On the individual side of the house, which is absolutely amazing, is the fact that once we started to really rally around our sense of why as an organization and started talking to individuals who are either close to CHC, 1 degree or 2 degrees of separation from CHC, they say, I got what you are doing, and I want to be involved. And within the first 4 months of us actually going down this path, we actually received a major gift. And in fact, the donor called and said, well, we want to do a couple of things with you. What else can we do? And I think part of that is because of what was said earlier, transparency, the ability to be competent and basically say, this is what we're good at. This is what we're not good at. Here's how we can be of service to you to further your mission, has been something that we've been able to do. And what we're hoping to continue to do is be consistent in that. Because I think being consistent as a nonprofit organization is critical in terms of fostering that sense of trust.
It's really, thank you for sharing that. That's so helpful to hear, because that sense of building the understanding what motivates the donors has to be inherent in the staff embracing that and embodying that, right? So the sense of why, the theory of change I know that you all were developing, that the sense of building collaborations and community partnerships, because it's more than just you as an organization. Those all can, and they really, donors will know. I mean, they're savvy enough to know, is this an organization, I think as it was said earlier, are they doing good in the world? Are they making the world a better place? And so the approach that you're taking, kind of rebuilding it from the inside, and engaging your stakeholders to then inspire your external stakeholders is so important to hear. Brady, let me turn it to you, because Charity Water is in so many ways in a league of its own. And I often, in a good way, I often cite it as really just the model, because you broke the mold on what traditional fundraising looks like. You all have been innovative and have created an incredible community of owners, of stakeholders, of champions. So, and I think one of the things you had said was that this was sort of built into your DNA from the beginning. So can you walk us through what that has looked like in terms of donor engagement and communications?
Sure. Yeah. So from day one, you know, when Paige was showing her research, which is great, the far side was like, oh, you don't want to touch those people. She said it friendlier than that. But the skeptics and the apathetic, Charity Water was basically built to say, we want those people, right? It was a club promoter founder who had friends who were hugely skeptical that said, where's the money going to go and how do I know? And said, I'll take the money, I'll go to Liberia, I'll build a well, and I'll come back and I'll say, here's where your money went. And that's the model that we have today, which is hyper-focused on proof and transparency, because whether you read research from the BBB, Wise Giving Alliance, or just been in fundraising, you know that everyone wants to know, and Diedrich said it earlier, what are you going to do with my money? That's the fundamental question. And so we have the luxury of doing kind of one thing, water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH, and not that it's not complicated, but we're singularly focused on WASH as opposed to a lot of other international organizations that do so many different things. It's very hard to kind of have that hyper-transparency, hyper-proof. So we're very lucky that we have that, and we're lucky that we have that built into our model from day one. And so we're trying to keep it pretty simple. What are we going to do? We do it. We tell you that we did it, and try to not get too complicated or too much in our own way. And yeah, we've just been really lucky that that's something that has worked. And now you can kind of hear different research or different, the more that we know about donor motivation, you can almost reverse engineer why Charity Water was able to succeed so much because of kind of removing some of these traditional blockers that people had to giving, and especially giving internationally, which has another level of opaqueness to it because it's not around the corner, it's not around the street. I don't know what Malawi looks like. I don't know what Bangladesh looks like. So that element's been really, really critical for us.
And it's in a way, because you started with that, that mindset of addressing the skeptics. What are all the things that the skeptics could say to reinforce perhaps perceptions that they would have had, informed or uninformed, and mindsets around not giving? That sort of changed the way then you rethink your fundraising strategies and approaches. Julia, let me ask you from the behavioral research perspective, what has your research and the studies shown as the most important ways to engage around impact storytelling, reporting back to donors to make them, and other stakeholders, to make them feel engaged?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, the answer is complicated. Brady, I'm glad you brought up transparency. I think we talked about this when we were prepping for the panel. Donors want to be informed, right? We know this, but they don't want to be overwhelmed, right? And I think there's this, we've all sort of drafted that 3-paragraph email. Nobody wants to read that 3-paragraph email, right? So as a nonprofit, I think it's really tempting to show your work and to show, like, here's the evidence, here's the transparency. Donors don't really want all that. It's not helpful, and in fact, it's too much information. What they do want is to be reassured. They want to be included. We think about sort of inviting donors into the conversation with you as an organization versus broadcasting out to them. In behavioral science, there's something called the IKEA effect, where we value something that we've helped to create more than something that was just given to us, right? So engaging donors in sort of the creation of impact, I think, is a really great way to make them feel like they can be, hopefully, lifelong donors. And just around storytelling on impact specifically, I think, it's tough to tell a story about what you're doing. I think it might be easier when you have an organization that does something that's very measurable. But framing is so important, right? I noted something interesting in the donor trust report, which was when asked what makes an organization trustworthy, most donors said that its accomplishments made it trustworthy. But when asked why they would not give to that organization, it wasn't the inverse of that. It wasn't a lack of accomplishments. It was, bad financial ratios. And so the way you talk about your organization is so important, right? If you lead with the thing that you think will reassure someone, that's what they're going to anchor on. And so if you lead with the sort of financial health, it might invite more scrutiny into that. Whereas if you lead with the storytelling around the impact, that's what the donors are going to focus on.
Thank you for that. So let me just dig in a little bit more as a follow-on to the, because I could geek out all day about philanthropic psychology and behavioral science, but for the interest of time, we won't. I want to just ask this follow-on question. So it was Paige, I think, mentioned it in her report around the sense of identity and connectedness and what people are looking for, just that drives them, right? And we know impact is the top reason why donors give. That sense of connection to the cause personally, right? The second reason. But can you just talk to us about the other psychological principles that go into how donors behave, donors and stakeholders, volunteers and champions and all the others?
Probably shouldn't turn this off every time. So yeah, I'll start by just defining what behavioral science means for us, right? Which is really about understanding how people behave in the real world, how people actually behave. Not how we would like them to, not how we think they might, right? We think about, and behavioral science was really born out of behavioral economics, which was born out of this idea that economics are built on models and not on how real people behave. We're not these robots that think that, make all these endless calculations. The most important thing, I think if we could put one giant thing on our Ideas 42 website, it would be context matters. Context matters maybe more than anything else, right? Most donors don't wake up in the morning thinking, I have this set of 5 priorities, or I have this goal. They're gonna make decisions throughout the day based on the context that they come into contact with. And that could be a day-to-day context. Earlier I was talking about just the time of day you send an email could be make or break, but also just the broader context, right? Who are they? Who are their relationships with, et cetera. So I'll try to keep this short. This is going to be the fastest BSI 101 that I've ever done. But we really talk about 5 overarching behavioral buckets in our work. So the first one is attention, and this has come up before earlier this morning. Attention is limited. Everybody's attention is limited. Donor attention is especially limited, especially out in the wild, right? In order to capture a donor, I was saying at lunch to my table, you can't just incept people. You have to catch them as they're walking through a door. And a lot of people are flagging people down on the other side of that door. So attention is really tough. Leveraging specific channels that those donors are engaging with is a great strategy to make sure that they can see the work that you're doing. A second really important one is emotion. Right? We get a warm glow from giving. There's a lot of science around this. That means that a lot of giving is actually pretty reactive and impulsive. Sometimes it might even be a little bit irrational, right? We give to what moves us. We don't necessarily give because we read 37 pages of a financial report. And so because it's reactive, because sometimes it's a little bit impulsive, it often means that it's not planned. It might not even be that strategic. And so the third bucket that we talk about is feedback. Feedback is so important, and this is such an untapped opportunity, I think, for nonprofits, is giving donors feedback on their giving behavior. And that could be anything from, one example that we have is what we did a test with something called the Personal Giving Review. It was literally just an end-of-year email that a DAF sent out to their donors that said, here's what you put in, here's what you granted out. And just getting that email made people give more grants and bigger grants, because it just put them into contact with their own intention-action gap. And an intention-action gap, we all have them. We all made those New Year's resolutions and didn't follow through. But donors have them too. We have the sense of, here's how I think of myself as a donor, and does my giving over the course of the last year actually match that? I don't know. So giving people feedback about how they give is so important. The fourth bucket is just social norms and identity. So this sort of touches on what we were talking about before. We're not just sort of motivated by who we are, but we take cues from our community about implicit rules. We look to sort of implicit and descriptive social norms around what other people are doing. So another, I think, sort of untapped area is peer effects and social influence, right? Telling donors what other donors are doing, huge. Everybody wants to know what everybody else is doing. I just wrapped up a project where that was maybe the biggest insight, which is donors want to know what everybody else is doing. And the last thing is choice overload, right? Choice paralysis is huge. The nonprofit sector is enormous. There's so many organizations. It's so hard to choose. So curation, I think, is really, that's a big, big part of our work, is really how can you do better curation? How can you reduce the choice set and make it more compelling for donors? So I think that was the fastest I've ever described those 5. I'll stop there, but we do have examples from our work of ways that just changing the context slightly has really had huge effects in the way that behavior could change afterwards.
Thank you for that overview. And I'm going to pick up on and ask Brady and Jean that last part you talked about, the sense of agency. I used a different word, but it was sort of that sense of agency, competence, right? Donors want to feel they have choice in where they give, how they give, when they give. They are that their gift of any amount or their contribution of time or talent or treasure of any kind is making a difference. And then that sense of connected, like they're with others. They're either with others who are doing the same thing, or they're fighting against others who are going against the cause that they want to support. So they're either in or they're out of a group. So Brady, let me ask you first, because the spring has this incredibly powerful sense of identity amongst your monthly supporters. So talk to us a little bit about that and how else you tap into those three: agency, connectedness, and competence?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot in there. One of the things that I think we've done not so great in the space is made so much of our fundraising on the transactional end of the spectrum, where there's so much more research around what we're talking about today, the communal side of the spectrum. In transactional, if all you need to do is get the donation today, then having this high pressure give today, it's a one-to-one decision, you can help someone, you will get an increased gift. But then they get that warm glow and go on their business, and they're not tied to anything larger, right? It was this very individual thing. Something that's more communal for us to say, there's 703 million people on the planet who do not have access to life's most basic need. We really believe that there will be a day in our lifetime where that will be zero, but we can't do it alone. And so whether you give $5 a month or $50 or $50,000, everyone is a part of this movement, this mission to end the water crisis in our lifetime. And so the positioning hasn't been just give $40 and you can provide clean water to a person today. We will do that at times, but it's trying to be rooted in a larger narrative of saying, here's something that we can end, and it's something ambitious and motivating and difficult. It's not just, hey, give today before tax season. So it's finding how to use some of the right levers at the right time. It has to be positioned within this larger narrative. And then we do a lot of storytelling and showcasing of other members in the spring. So if you go on our landing page, there's testimonials of other people. Once a year we have an event where we showcase other members. We really try to connect spring members to other spring members so that you don't feel alone, right? It's one thing to say you're a part of a community and then you never hear about anyone else in the community. That is not a community. So it's hard to create digital communities when you're united in just how you give, but one of the things that you can do is at least tell other people about the other people in this community that you're trying to facilitate. And that's been a huge component of the spring. And the last thing on choice, especially for subscription giving or monthly giving, constantly focusing on choice is huge. One of the reasons why people don't do it is they don't want to be locked into a monthly gift that they'll just run and run and run and run, and then they have to call you to cancel, and it's annoying. And so what we really emphasize, you can pause, cancel, or change anytime. You'll see that language all over our site, in our emails. We remind you about your monthly gift every month, because if you do not want to give to us, that's great. But maybe you should consider pausing. But this idea of set it and forget it is an old, non-positive way to think about monthly giving. And so really trying to accentuate autonomy or choice in subscription giving is really, really powerful.
That's great. Jean, what else would you add?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the point about the overarching narrative. So at CHC, one of the things we've talked about, and when we talk to our various donors, is the fact that there's a huge gap in life expectancy in this country that is largely driven by where you live. So this is the social drivers of health. The gap is 13 years on average. So if you live in one neighborhood, you might have the likelihood of living 13 years longer than someone who's just 2 miles down the street. Think about that. 2 neighborhoods, 2 miles down the street, 13-year life expectancy difference. Does that seem fair to you? What have you done in the last 13 years? Now imagine if you didn't have that time, that emotional appeal, because that's what we're working on. And then we take it a step further. Whether it's in the context of maternal health and the maternal health crisis in this country. We have a Black Birthing Initiative that is designed to work with our partners in local communities to address the upstream, midstream, and downstream effects of the crisis that's facing, because it has life implications. When we talk to businesses about this, we talk about the economic costs of what this means to your business. Because what tends to happen is the fact that where you live, those employees come into the workforce. So if you have a healthier community, you're likely to have a healthier group of people, a healthier workforce, which means more resiliency and more profitability for your organization. Not addressing this is something that we cannot afford. And that overarching narrative resonates with the different donor segmentations, because what we're doing is so that we all have an opportunity to help close this gap. And we can't afford to have anyone at the margins. And we've received significant support, whether it's time, whether it's talents, or whether it's treasures, because people can wrap their heads around this idea of, wow, you mean that if I just live in this zip code right here, I may not have more time to spend with my spouse or my partner or see my kids grow older because of the fact of the healthcare system is non-existent or the quality of the environment. So people can wrap their heads around that. And I think that emotional appeal, but also connecting it to here's what we can do together, is critically important.
So, follow-on question then, there's that tension between the short-term, right, the short-term results, I've just given or donated time for this to happen, versus for both of your organizations, you're in the long game. Addressing health inequities and eliminating those is not going to happen overnight. Brady, same with getting access to clean water to the 700 million people who don't have it. So how do you then address that or build that into the way you tell your story, report back between the short-term and the long-term results?
So on the maternal health crisis, one of the things that we've been able to do, and I love the points that were made on the panel, is marry storytelling with data. So for example, for the month of Black History Month in February, we did an entire series called the Doula Diaries. And this was actually lived experiences of doulas. Every day, you hear the stories of how they're impacting the infrastructure in our country to address the maternal health crisis, and how through this initiative, they are getting paid fair wages, that they are getting benefits in the whole 9 yards. So that is one of the elements to it. The other aspect of this, too, is also having conversations with our donors, and these sometimes are courageous conversations in terms of exactly how do we manage expectations. If you're really trying to address the root causes of an issue, it is an upstream process, and it is a long term. So how do we, from the beginning, discuss what success look like? And in one case, it also requires being very transparent. As I mentioned earlier, we actually told a donor, a funder, that the marketplace, the market that they wanted us to do some work in was not ready for what they were proposing. And they said they were surprised because they're based in that market, but they appreciated the candor. And that has created goodwill for us to think about longer term solutions. So it is a challenge that I think many nonprofits are facing, particularly as many organizations are looking to provide smaller and shorter term funding cycles, which kind of takes you to a specific downstream approach. So it is a constant thing that we are monitoring, but I think part of it is having those courageous conversations and really trying to manage expectations, and then also as an organization saying, you know what, no thank you. This is great, but we can't do it.
I mean, nothing dispels trust from a funder or donor or stakeholder than taking the money and then not being able to deliver, right? Because that's exactly what the donors are giving for some sort of result. Brady, what would you add?
I think, again, the storytelling component is massive. There's like an old adage, numbers tell and stories sell, and that is overly simplistic, but it's true. I think one thing that we've learned is that the promise of impact is far more powerful than delivering the impact, right? Saying you can see exactly where your project goes, everyone loves that. The number of people who log in, go to their map and explore it, very, very small number, right? So we still have to fulfill the promise that we made, otherwise that significantly breaks trust. But so much of what donors want to hear is just what the promise is. They want to have a compelling offer or impact that they know they'll make, even though they care a little bit less about when it's done. So I think that's really interesting. And so for us, typically a project is 18 to 21 months, or it has been historically. And so if someone would give us money, we would send it to our programs and partners in the field, and then we just told it's 18 to 21 months. And that is a long cycle to get reporting and updates. You get 2 updates and then a completion report. And a challenge of our Major Gifts fundraising team was we often work on annual cycles and renewal rates and repeat rates within a calendar year. And this project won't even be complete for 21 months. And so we've spent about 1.5 years trying to figure out a way of how can we still make this bold promise to donors, but how can we narrow the time frame to be less than a year so that people can get a more tangible impact and not just it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And so that's taken a long, long time for us to figure out across our programs team, our marketing team, our major team, everyone to figure out. And something we'll have later this year is to try to shorten that window a little bit and not solely rely on the content and stories that we have, which is massive. I mean, that's what gets us in between those data points is content and storytelling.
Julia, I see you nodding your head vigorously. So I'd love to hear what your perspectives are from that behavioral science lens.
I mean, I just agree. I think both of you are taking really effective strategies. And I just want to say overall, even this morning, I just found myself nodding along saying, wow, everyone here has like really behaviorally informed best practices to their work. So if I could all give you my little B-size seal, I would. But no, I think, Brady, what you said about people, like the promise more than the delivery, I think that's so important. People want to feel like they're contributing to be a part of something. And, earlier when I was saying donors don't want to be informed but not overwhelmed, they want to know that they can overwhelm themselves if they want. So like giving them the login to see where all that stuff lives is enough, right? Because that builds goodwill, it builds trust, and maybe some of them will look at it, but just sometimes just knowing that that information is there is enough, right? And I think one thing I would just add is beyond storytelling, and we'll talk about this I think a little bit later too, but just trying to articulate what that theory of change is, right? And that's, I think, what can connect the short term to the longer term is, what are you doing now? How do those pieces add up to the interim? And how does that finally add up to the final piece?
That actually just sparked a question that I had, which is sometimes people can feel overwhelmed by, and I think it was the picture in Asha's presentation of the woman who said, I'm not a big donor, I don't have $1 million, but I can make a difference. And so often some donors will feel like their $20, their $50 couldn't possibly solve health inequities or the clean access to clean water. So what is that balance then in how nonprofit leaders and fundraisers rethink their communications so that their donors feel like gifts, time of every kind is going to be helping move the closer towards the goalpost?
I mean, I think there's a parallel here with voting, right? Everybody might think like my individual vote doesn't count, but without any votes, we wouldn't have anything, right? And so I think the like we can't do this without you framing is really powerful. It might seem trite, but it's true, right? And the sum adds up to more than its parts. But I would also say, we've talked a lot about transactional versus relational giving, and relational giving is a huge part of making people feel like their $20 is more than just $20. It also makes it feel like if they are overwhelmed, they have someone they can turn to ask a question rather than just disengage from the relationship altogether. And so I think, building that interpersonal connectedness, whether it's with the CEO or a program officer, or development officer, or even just other people, in the spring, it's really important.
Which then leads me to my next question around segmentation. And so often we think, I started our panel with my introductory remarks around the spray and pray, the one size fits all kind of approach. It doesn't feel, to the reader, it won't feel like it's personal to them, right? It's just they're part of a mass e-blast. So when we think about segmentation, how are you each thinking about, Jean, Brady, about segments? Are you thinking along giving levels? Are you thinking along gender, race, roles, age? What are the models that you have found work best for how you communicate that impact to inspire more donors to stick around, more donors to upgrade?
All right, I'll start then. So this is interesting because we are not overly huge believers of over-segmentation. And I think part of it goes back to what Paige said. So much of what we used to segment around, dollar amounts, when you gave, these don't actually tell us anything about you as a person. So it's very RFM model, transactional model, nothing. So even across demographics, whether you're 18 or 80, the thing that we're trying to focus most on is say if you care about the water crisis or an innovation brand or a tech-forward brand, or there's commonalities, whether you're 20, 40, 60, 80, and that is kind of our main value set that we're trying to communicate and have that be the bullseye that we kind of go out to acquire and communicate. And then even within trying to build a brand, we think about experiences and products, but then within the brand, whether you give once or monthly or sponsor a full water project, there is a baseline experience from the brand and communications that everyone should get, because 1 out of 8 major donors started giving at $500 or less. And so if we go down this path of over-personalization, it actually creates a problem for us later on, and I think it hinders our ability to build a brand. So if you think of like a 2x2 matrix where it's like high personalization and low personalization, and then low scale and high scale, everyone's dream is like highly personalized, highly scaled comms. Almost impossible, right? So then you don't want to have low and low, that sucks. So then in between, you have to make a choice. Highly personalized to a few people, which is what almost every nonprofit does, right? To cater to major. And then we lose a mass experience that is elevated for everyone. So this person has a great experience, and then this is kind of lower. And that's not how you build a really quality consumer level brand where everyone can play that role. And so that's kind of how we approach it, of saying, I know there's more value perhaps, but the trade-offs for us are worth it to have this kind of brand and comm benefit that exists in this space.
Well, and actually, that's really refreshing to hear, because we know, especially over the last few years, that part of what's striking is that the number of donors who are declining the most are those who are under $500, right? So, which to me signals that there's an overemphasis on, to Jane's earlier point this morning, around that sort of concentration of high wealth. Nonprofits are starting to just zero in only on that group of donors as opposed to the wider funding base. So Jean, how are you all thinking about donor segmentation?
So just building off the points that Bradley mentioned, I think as we're building our culture of philanthropy, I think it's on the fee-for-service side of the work that we do, particularly with our workplace giving. We have noticed a different shift in the changing nature of work, the workforce, and what does that mean in terms of employees actually giving. And there is some generational differences there. So really kind of thinking about, particularly for younger employees, how are we going to attract them and make that connection, particularly between them as employees with their employers towards this idea of greater giving. So that is something that we're significantly looking at in terms of exactly how do we attract, how do we encourage, and I know that there's some data that talks about it's very difficult to give when you don't have any, or you also have student loans. I think some from the panel mentioned that earlier. So how do we talk about the different ways of giving beyond just monetary? So for us, we also have a huge volunteerism program. So how can we engage different employees, particularly the younger generation, in terms of volunteering and giving back as a form of giving? As we build out our major gift and our individual program within CHC, one of the things that we're looking at is data analytics and really understanding that experience, particularly for the donor. Why are they giving? What resonates with them? How can we make sure that we're providing the right information at the right time with the right content? And then there's the power of storytelling in terms of exactly coming back and saying your contribution was able to help us do A, B, C, and D. Or in some cases, we had a situation where one of our participants through the Black Birthing Initiative was right a week before Christmas, their house caught on fire. And she was 2 weeks from giving birth. And they had to relocate and try to find a hotel. So we were able to rally not just our staff, but also our donors around this situation, not identifying the person, but saying we have someone in our program who has just experienced a catastrophic loss, and she's 2 weeks from giving birth, and they have 2 other kids. So there's different ways of giving and getting people to join and engage, and it's just a matter of building that up for us.
Julia, what would you add then in terms of the donor segments or segmenting generally across, generational, racial, age, gender, so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think segmenting is important. I think it can be really tricky. Thank you again, Paige, for setting up this conversation so well before. I think, we've seen a lot more variation within traditional segments, especially when you're thinking about demographic segmentation, than we have seen across segments. And so, a lot of the work that we do is not dissimilar. It's about looking at different ways in which you can classify people. And so just taking a couple of examples, when we think about level of giving or level of wealth, what really matters there, again, is the context, right? The context that they're giving in. And so one trend that we've seen emerging is really not so much about level of wealth, but about the distinction between DIY donors and assisted donors. And so it's pretty self-explanatory, but DIY donors are those that really engage with the giving system on their own. They're making decisions themselves, they're interacting, they're making a donation online, writing a check. Assisted donors are those who are assisted by either staff or advisors or maybe a donor community. And sure, there's a correlation there with wealth. It's unlikely that, lower income or everyday givers are paying a lot of money for assistance because it's usually not free. But on the other hand, you might have a high net worth donor who's engaging in the giving system the exact same way as a $50 donor, right? And so rather than thinking about them in terms of how much money they have, thinking about them in terms of how they're actually engaging with the space is a lot more important. Another segment that we think about is where along the donor journey is that donor, right? Are they new to giving? Are they a bit more seasoned? Are they veterans? And how can you use that information to help shift people down that path, right? Can you use more seasoned donors to engage the more newbie donors and reassure them, right? A lot of new donors they make those test donations. They tend to be a little bit more anxious about where the money's going. Once you give, you tend to give maybe more unrestricted funding, especially to repeat organizations. So again, I would just say, think creatively about how you can segment people, because how old they are, how much money they have, what gender they are, that doesn't actually tell you as much as you'd like. So.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'd like to make sure our audience has some time as well. Do you think that external validators, all the information that we have at our fingertips now and how we can sort of do our own sleuthing, if you would, does that play a role then in how donors think about impact, think about the sense of trust and transparency and all of those other factors that influence knowingly or unknowingly into their decisions? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in.
Go ahead, Julia, start.
I think evaluators do play a critical role. I think they are that repository of information that we need. But most donors, at least that we've seen, are engaging with evaluators to validate a decision that they're already in the process of making, whether the decision is to give or not to give. I think there's two big opportunities. One is for evaluators to think about, really to understand the power that they have in shaping social norms around what metrics matter and what metrics donors care about. If you tell donors to care about this, because that's 50% of your seal or something, that is what donors are going to care about. So there's huge power there. The second thing, and this is getting more into design, is there's a huge opportunity too to shift more away from search and more towards browsing, discovery, fun, right? I think there's not a lot of joy in finding information around nonprofits. We've cracked this in every other area, right? Like Netflix knows what I want before I want it. Can we do that here, right? And I know AI is a big scary thing that we haven't really talked about today, but is there a way to harness that for good to make that process just more joyful and enjoyable?
We will be talking about AI next. I'm looking right at Nathan.
I'll go next. I think that it plays a larger role for major donors than it does consumer retail donors, for sure. And we've run multiple experiments around where to put them and do they have a benefit. And we found that it's never a negative, but it's rarely a significant positive. It's a fairly low lever for most people. And things like a map that shows your impact or testimonials often are a much better driver in our testing for conversion than having the seals. So, and in a previous life, we did way more testing around seals. So it's always like, yes, have the seals. I think the seals, just picturing like Kiss from a Rose or like actual seals. Anyways, have the seals on your site, but don't have it be the first thing and like, look how well we're rated. Because it's not what donors are going and thinking about. They're like, how do I make a difference? Oh, what is this about? It's like pretty passive. So definitely have them, but we found other trust marks like testimonials from peers or a map around impact are a bigger driver for conversion for consumer level donors.
I think from CAC's perspective, it definitely helps. There's significant value in that, in part because it's particularly when there are major disasters or major crises and there are different stakeholders who are looking for organizations that they could automatically provide some support to. So having that sense of this has been trusted, this has been evaluated, that the metrics are clear, that there's levels of transparency, really helps, at least from some of the individuals that's reached out to CAC in the past. I'm just thinking about the fires in Hawaii, for example, where they're looking at like, who should we be giving to? What suggestions do you have? So being able to say that there are actually evaluators that have looked at using standardized metrics, some of these organizations, and here's some of the ratings for you to make an informed decision, I think has been helpful.
And I would just add, just in closing, that it's the exercise of going through the process and doing that internal building, just as you were describing, Jean, at the beginning of this discussion, around all the pieces and the building blocks that you were putting in place internally, going through a very rigorous process helps to make the organization stronger as a whole, which then means you're able to report out differently, more effectively. You're able to have a clearer sense of how you operate to your fullest potential, which then ultimately addresses that sense of impact that donors want to hear. Okay, well, so with that, I want to make sure we have about 5 more minutes, and if there are any questions from the audience.
Here's one. Thank you. Yes, thank you. That was so helpful, all of you. My question is for Brady. Brady, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how many FTEs are in your marketing and growth department, and whether or not at Charity Water there is like a dividing line between the number of people that are focused on development work versus communications, or is it all under the umbrella of marketing and growth? That would be great.
Yeah, great question. So within my team and department, there's about 21 FTEs. And so we are split across 2 major ways that we fundraise. Major, a couple people are here from our major team, and then consumer, and then mid-level is the kind of awkward in between where we're like, who does this? Like most nonprofits. We're figuring it out. And so where there's the overlap is we do all the comms for major for the most part as well. So it's not like 21 people, all we do is consumer and comms. We also support the major team as well. But that's how we're generally structured, and we all roll up under our chief revenue officer. So all revenue is under one team, major, consumer, and then a lot of our comms supports the major team.
Hi, guys. My question's for Julia. I love segmentation. I'm very interested in it. I find myself wondering about the relationship between segmentation being a front end and the back end of that being our expectation of what comes from the segmentation effort. Sometimes I feel like we segment with a belief that we're going to get all the segments to behave in the same way, which is not realistic. Have you done any research or included in any of your messaging work around our expectation of, for example, just letting someone never give $1 and having that be okay for our organizations, as opposed to the expectation being a driver of some specific outcome that's more of than the one size fits all?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will say segmentation is pretty new in the research that we've been doing. It sort of came about as an accident in this project that we just wrapped up. But I will say that, we're a research organization, so our focus on it is less about expectations and more about understanding what motivates people and what drives them so that we can design for that context specifically. And so Ideas 42, we work with different partners in the giving space, whether it's an intermediary or a DAF or a nonprofit directly. And I think similar to what Paige was talking about before, I think it's really about just getting a little bit more information for ourselves so that we can use that to design other things better, not necessarily about targeting them in a way to get some sort of return. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Any more questions? One more. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, perhaps we don't have enough time to discuss that, but I was triggered by the question about the seal and also about, and I'm from a Dutch monitoring organization, charity monitoring organization. So I was thinking 2 things. One is this morning we had a very inspirational morning where we talked about the overarching goals. When you talk about marketing, segmentations, donors, the interest of a donor and the interest of the organization not always goes hand in hand. So we have to be careful not to make this discussion instrumental in how do we get enough support, how do we keep the support, how do we get enough money in, because the bigger picture is that we all want to have this better world, and how do you connect on that level. So and monitoring organizations are also looking at that perspective of donors and are trying to make sure that we find that balance in the right way. A second point I wanted to make is that when you don't show the seal, and I understand that it is in a marketing, that it can be a marketing issue. Do you want to show that, or do you want to show what you do as an organization much more? But when when all charities with a seal are proud to show that seal, it means that that seal gets more known by the public, and because the public then knows what the seal means, then you don't have to show it anymore that pronounced at your website. But till that moment, we do need charities to show the seal in a very proud and way that people will see it and know what it means.
Any other questions? I think we're done. We're done. Thank you very much.